Benedict option is a strategy for being Christian in a world that no longer is Christian. What I mean by that is I think that we are living now in the West, in Europe and North America, in a time much like the fall of the Roman Empire. And if we look back to what St. Benedict and the early Benedictine monks did in response to the fall, they emerged out of the fall of Rome, they tendered civilization within their monasteries and slowly spread the gospel and also the cultural memory of classical civilization throughout Western Europe. And in so doing, they laid the groundwork for the rebirth of civilization. I think that today Christians who really believe in the faith have to play a similar role within our own communities. We're not called to be monks, only monks are called to be monks, but I think we can look to the early Benedictines as an example for what can be accomplished if we work together in community and live a disciplined, spiritually disciplined life and live only to serve God. You have to remember, St. Benedict did not go out to the woods from the city of Rome to make Rome great again or to save civilization. He only went to serve God with all his heart, his soul, and his mind in a community. And he changed our world. We're called to the same thing today. And I call it an option because we must make this choice. We are responsible for our choices. We can continue as Christians to live as if nothing is wrong and everything will continue as it is, or we can read the signs of the times and realize we must choose a more radical way of living as Christians if we're going to survive. Well, people always want to know, what do I mean between withdrawal and engagement? Because I say in the book that we need to withdraw from the world as Christians so that we can return to the world and engage them as faithful Christians. I'm not saying that we have to be Amish. A lot of people misread the book as saying we have to head for the hills and live in a commune. No, I believe that as lay Christians we are called to live in the world. But Christ tells us we have to live in the world but be not of the world. That means that even as we engage the world, as maybe the Franciscans of the Bronx do, we have to know who we are and maintain our distinct Christian beliefs and way of life. And this maybe was easier to do without thinking about it in the old days when culture was more openly Christian. Those days are gone. If we are not going to become completely deracinated as Christians and assimilated into post-Christian culture, we have to do some things on our own, in our own communities, in our own families, and in our own hearts to push back hard against the secularization. Christianity can't simply be a private opinion you have. Like everybody else in the world lives, and keep our religion to ourselves. If our hearts belong to Christ, it will change everything about our lives. And I think that those Christians who are living as if it was possible to separate their religious belief from everything in their life, they're not going to make it. We have to choose radically for Christ and choose radically for Him in a certain community. I don't want to live with my back to the rest of the world. I don't think that would be faithful. But I think that we have to consider ourselves much like the Hebrews living in their Babylonian exile. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 29, God says through the prophet to his people Israel, I have brought you to Babylon for my own purpose. And I want you to settle there and pray for the peace and prosperity of the city. And I think we're called to do the same thing in our own cities, our own places. But if you think to the story in the book of Daniel of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three Hebrew men who served the king, but they refused to bow down before the golden idol the king Nebuchadnezzar constructed. They were even prepared to die before betraying God. We have to have that kind of faith. Even as we live in the world, we have to serve the world, but when the time comes, when we are asked to bow down before an idol, and an idol can be anything, it could be a job, it could be the nation, it could be any number of things, we have to have the courage to refuse, even if it means martyrdom. I don't think it will, but if we don't have that courage of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, our faith is nothing. I think that Christians in the West today can look back to the example of Christians in the communist East, as in Poland, and also in the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, Václav Benda, who was one of the Václav Havel's inner circle. He was the only Christian in that circle, but Václav Havel and the others were very brave as well in their resistance to communism. I think in the case of Wałęsa, Lech Wałęsa, and in Solidarity, this goes back a long time. I asked an American professor about when I was writing the Benedict option, said, what do I need to know? And he said, the thing you should keep in mind is always ask yourself the question, what would Wojtyła do? I said, what do you mean? Pope John Paul II. He said that in the Second World War, when the Nazis invaded Poland, they tried to destroy Catholic culture and also a sense of the nation. Some Poles may have taken up weapons against the Nazis. Wojtyła and his circle of actors, they knew that they had to preserve the memory of Polish culture and Polish Catholicism amid this oppression. So they would stage theatrical shows, plays, underground, and the people who went to see them, the plays would remind themselves of the Catholic faith and also what it means to be a Pole. Everybody risked their lives to tell this story, but they did it and they survived the Nazis. Well, in a similar way, we have to pay very close attention to the power of culture and of cultural memory of the West, not just of the stories of the West, the non-Christian stories, but especially the things that tell us who we are as Christians and what Christianity has meant. Havel, Václav Benda, and the others under communism much later, they were completely disempowered by communism, but that did not give them the freedom to refuse politics. Politics is a search for the common good and how we live together in common. Because they weren't communists, in fact, they were enemies of the communist state, they were not allowed to participate in formal politics. But they did what Havel called anti-political politics. It's the politics of being a decent person, living with integrity. Václav Benda, for example, because he was kicked out of the universities for not teaching Marxism, he and his colleagues organized private classes, underground classes. So the memory of Western art and literature and things like that could be preserved in the long night of communism. I think we have to look to them for examples. If we as Christians feel pushed out of normal politics because we don't see our values represented and we have only bad choices, that's too bad, but that does not mean that we can refuse to work for the common good. Anytime we do small things like starting a new school or helping farmers or doing any good thing for the community, that's a form of politics. And in fact, I think it can be a very powerful witness to the Christian faith to people who no longer believe. Modern times, in the sense that I mean, began with the Enlightenment, with the attempt to separate ourselves from God and our Christian heritage in any authoritative way, and to use reason alone as the bounds for our discourse, our public discourse, and our thinking. That has failed. But I think a lot of people, Christians, even if they still profess the faith, have allowed themselves to be absorbed by modernity and to absorb the habits of modernity, the rootlessness. Pope Benedict XVI and a friend of his, Marcello Pera, Italian senator, wrote a book that in English was called Without Roots, talking about how we cannot survive as a civilization without those deep roots. And for me, I say that goes to the pre-modern past. We look at the Middle Ages, for example, as a time of darkness, of repression and so forth. I think this is completely wrong. I think that we can look back to how France and how the West was living in a time when we had more organic unity in society and see what we can do to take the best lessons from that. We can't turn back the clock. We're never going to go back to some sort of golden age, I think the last utopia ended when Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden. But I do think that we have to live as if God was present all the time around us in a sort of an enchanted world. You know, we talk in modernity about the disenchantment of the world, where people lost the sense of the presence of God everywhere. I think God is present everywhere and in all things. It's a matter in many ways of learning to see what is already there. In the Divine Comedy of Dante, which is one of my favorite books, the pilgrim Dante learns to see again. That his progress in spirituality is measured by his ability to see more light, more light. I think there's a lesson there for us, that our progress in spirituality in this darkness of modernity is learning to see God present in each other and all around us, and to care for our world as if it were sacred, because I believe it really is. It's not a very modern way to think. In modern terms, we think of the individual as sacred and individual desires as the holiest thing. That's not true. The individual is only sacred in relation to God. We can only decide what is sacred as it relates to God, the God of the Bible. And so to make a real rebellion against modernity is to make a rebellion for holiness, to make a rebellion for the joy of life, a life that is filled with the love of God. And it's really a powerful thing. In Le Pari Benedictin, I speak about a great flood that is on the world now and coming even stronger. I compare our current times to the times of the flood of Noah from the Bible. I use it as a metaphor because a sociologist of the 20th and 21st century, Zygmunt Bauman, said that we live in what is called liquid modernity. That's his phrase, liquid modernity. He contrasts it to solid modernity as solid modernity, I should say, was a time we were in the modern times, in the Enlightenment, and things were beginning to change in a modern way, but they were changing slowly enough to where people could adjust to them, and life did not seem incomprehensible, out of control. But at some point in the 20th century, that solid modernity became liquid, in the sense of things were changing so fast that people did not have time to adapt to them. And so we have today a sense that nothing is solid, everything is melting around us. I think this is the condition we're living in. I heard recently an American senator, a leading politician, talking to a Christian audience. He did not mention politics once, but he talked about how now the world we live in will always be one of constant, rapid, traumatic change. The certainties of the family are breaking down and will continue to break down. Communities will be broken down. The ability to believe in God and have a firm philosophy or theology will be more difficult. And people will lose meaningful work. That's part of this globalist capitalist economy. I think we should try to resist that in whatever ways we can, but we can't stop it. So when I talk about this as being liquid modernity and the church as being an ark that will allow us to ride out the wave of the flood and not be drowned in the flood of liquid modernity, that's what I mean. I think that we need anchors. We need an anchor, we need roots, and we need something relatively safe to shelter against these powerful currents. Because if we try to stop it, we'll be drowned, we'll be ruined, we'll be flooded out. I feel that we are being called by God to build our own arks, in a way of speaking. That's what the Benedict option communities are, yes, in our parishes, but also among Christians ourselves, in our schools and different associations, agricultural associations, prayer groups, all sorts of things like that. These are arcs that will allow us to ride out liquid modernity until the floodwater recedes and we can reach solid ground and then replant the earth with the faith. Yeah, arcs are for everybody, I believe. I think we have to be open to the rest of the world, because if we believe that we have the good news of Jesus Christ, Christ didn't come to save only certain people. He came for all of us. We have to keep our eyes on that. Plus, the rule of St. Benedict talks about hospitality, how important hospitality is, and to receive others as if they were Christ. So we have to have that open door to our communities. In the same way, though, the Benedictine monks have certain rules that they will not allow visitors to come into the community and disrupt the life of the community. I think we have to be that way also as lay Christians. We must be open to the world, but we have to maintain strong boundaries against ourselves in the world so that when people come into our communities, they will see real Christians. And when we go out into the world, we go out as real Christians who know what Christians believe, know how Christians love, and we can be salt and light to the rest of the world in that way. I think of it like this too. I'm very close to Saint Genevieve of Paris, and there's a great story about her where she and her nuns were walking in the dark to Vespers one night, and a wind came and blew her light out, and she made the sign of the cross and the flame came back. Well, I think for us Christians to go out in this world today, it's like walking out into a storm, a tempest. And if we're going to protect our light that shows us the way through the dark wood, we need to have intense faith. I don't think any of us can be miracle workers like St. Genevieve, but you never know. But I think we do have to be aware of how much faith it requires to bear the light of Christ into the world for everyone and call everyone else to it. In France, the word communitarianism means something different than in America. In the US, communitarianism is completely a positive thing. It's the idea of putting the community's interest over individual interest in a positive way. We're such an individualistic country that a lot of people see the need to place more value on the community to balance things. But I understand in France it has a much more negative connotation as being separate from everybody else in a hostile way. And I think we have to be careful about that. When I speak to French people, I'm very careful to define my terms to say that I'm not saying we have to establish Benedict option communities in that negative sense, because I don't believe the Christian faith is an angry faith, or if you're doing it right, it's not angry. You can find very angry Christians who are a very bad advertisement for the faith. But I think we have to be careful not to become so separatist and angry that we're a negative presence among others. On the other hand, if we don't have this strong sense of ourselves built up through our own communities, then what good are we to the world? What good are we to Jesus? What good are we to the world? There's nothing wrong at all with having our own traditions and celebrating those traditions and inviting others to be part of our traditions. But we can't do it without community. I tried for so long to live as a Christian with very individualistic ideas because I was so afraid to commit myself to any kind of community. But it can't work. I mean, God made us for life in community and society. We need other Christians to rub the rough edges off of ourselves, and we need contact with people outside of our Christian community so we can always remember that we're there to serve and to be humble. I don't think we should be afraid of community. I really don't, but we just have to make sure we're doing it for the right reasons, that we're not running away from something, but we're running towards something good. In the U.S., we have certain Christian schools, we call them classical Christian schools, that are rising. It's a new movement that's trying to root Christian students much more deeply in the traditions of the West and of the faith than you get in normal Christian schools or in public schools. You see a lot of Christian families who are running away from decadence in public schools or normal Christian schools, and that's fine. But we're trying to get them to realize you're running towards something really good and positive. And it's taking a little time to work that nuance out, but that's no reason to refuse the attempt. What do I say to people who are not Christian believers, but who really are attached to Christian culture? Well, we have to affirm what is good about that. I love that there are people who don't share my faith, but who do recognize that Christianity and Christian culture has played a very important role in the creation of everything we see around us, our culture around us, and who want to preserve that. But I would also say the best way to do that is to come to believe. You know, that our churches must not be museums of the saints. They have to be real living communities. Myself, I was converted as a 17-year-old by visiting the cathedral at Chartres. I was an American kid, teenager, who thought he knew everything. But I was on a tour bus of Europe with a bunch of old people, and I went into the cathedral at Chartres not believing in Jesus. I threw my faith away. But I went into that cathedral and I met God. I met the living God. I felt somewhere in this magnificent old temple, God is speaking to me through the spiritual grandeur of its lines and the stone and the glass. I didn't walk out of that church as a Christian again, but I walked out of it on a search for God because I first felt the call in that old cathedral. So I say to the French, I mean, look around you. Look at how God is speaking and continues to speak through your magnificent old churches and through other ways too. It's a question of learning how to see the presence of God in all things, mediated in things. But if our churches and our traditions are only valued for their aesthetic quality or their historic quality, they won't last. And this is a sad thing, but it's true. The form itself is important, but the form is only really important in the end if it contains God. If these churches, these old churches and these old traditions point beyond themselves to a life-changing encounter with the living God. The good news is they do, they still do, but we have to learn to see it and hear it and feel it and taste it again, and we have to train our children to see it, to hear it, to feel it and taste it again, to form their consciences to be aware of our God everywhere present and filling all things. So I would say to my secular friends who love the old churches, come back to church. We need you. You need us. We need each other. It's a marvelous thing to be a follower of this great tradition that built churches like Chartres. You have things here in France that I only dream of in America. This deep, deep way of living, this deep tradition, this beauty. And just thank God for it and show your thanks to God for it by embracing it again and making it part of your life, not just something you go visit on holiday, but part of your everyday life. In the US, I've been writing about the Benedict option for over 10 years, since I first encountered the ideas of the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, who wrote in his book After Virtue that the Enlightenment tradition is dying out, that it turns out we can't actually build a cohesive society on reason alone. Encountering that book and that idea made me realize he's onto something. This explains a lot of what I'm seeing happen all around me in my culture. MacIntyre also said at the last paragraph of the book that today we await a new and quite different Saint Benedict. I began to think around 2005, 2006, what would a Saint Benedict of our own time, what would he say? What would he have us do? And so for a decade or more, I've been writing about this, but it became a national topic of discussion after the gay marriage decision of the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court in 2015. Because of our constitutional arrangement in America, suddenly religious liberty became very much in the crosshairs of controversy. If churches continue to preach and teach in Christian schools traditional Christian doctrine on sexuality, they could lose their tax status, they can be punished in many different ways under this new ruling. And so a lot of Christians finally woke up and realized how much we've lost. And then they started saying, well, tell us about this Benedict option. And I tell them, look, if we never had gay marriage, we would still need the Benedict option because our gay marriage is only a symptom of a much deeper malaise and a loss of roots, loss of coherence. A number of Christians, both evangelicals and Catholics, say, yes, you're right, let's learn more, let's go back into our traditions and work on this. But there are also a lot who refuse it. First, they say falsely, oh, you're calling for fundamentalism, you're calling us to run head for the hills and burrow down. Of course that's not true. Anybody who reads my book can see that's not true. But I think the fact that they have this immediate response tells us something about the fear of change people have. They would rather believe, a lot of American Christians, that if we only elect the right politician and get the right judges on the bench, then everything is going to be okay. They're looking for a political solution to a cultural problem. And beyond culture, spirituality. The only real solution can come from returning to the faith, from and organizing our lives around what we know to be true from the Christian tradition. I think it's important to be engaged in politics and business and everything else, but nothing is as important as returning to the faith. And I think a lot of Americans are nervous about that because it means that if what the Benedict option says is true, then they have to change their lives, and nobody wants to change. But what's been interesting about it, David Brooks of the New York Times called it the most important religious book of the decade. I was very, very honored that he said that, but I've come to see that it is true because it forces Christians in my country, and I hope in other countries, to face the seriousness with which in which we're now living, the critical nature of our times, how this is a time for choosing. We can't just sit back and let things happen to us, because the choices we make today as Christians will set the future for our children and our whole societies. It did for St. Benedict back in his day. Again, he didn't set out to save the empire, he set out to serve God, but because he had that little mustard seed of faith, great things came centuries later for all of us. I would also say too that some people ask me, how can you be so gloomy and pessimistic about the cultural situation, but also talk about joy? It comes easy to somebody like me from Louisiana, because when we have a hurricane coming, the first thing Louisiana people do is you board up your house and get ready for the storm, but then you get out your black iron pot and you make gumbo and you ice down the beer and call your neighbors over and ride out the storm together. I think that comes from our French culture, I think, but it comes from a sense of we're all in this together. Let us enjoy what we have together, and let's meet the storm together. And when the storm has passed, let's rebuild together. We had a terrible flood in Baton Rouge, where I live, last year. But it was a moment of incredible grace for us. You saw, before the government could respond, you saw people from the churches, Protestant churches, Catholic churches, rushing out to save people, to feed them, to give them houses. We were at our best in the middle of that crisis, because still in Louisiana, the faith is stronger than in other parts of the U.S. And it made me so proud to be from Louisiana. But it also told me that this is what we do, because we're Christian people. In that same sense, I think that we Christians everywhere must be realistic about the difficulties we face. And we also have to realize nobody's going to come to save us. We can't wait for the Pope or the priest or the pastor or the evangelist to come save us. We are part of the church too. We are given so many graces and information, but also graces to allow us to save ourselves and our communities. And by doing so, I think we will save everybody else from liquid modernity. We only have to have the courage to be hopeful, and the courage and the daring and the audacity to love as Jesus loved. I think a lot of Christian authorities don't understand this message because they feel it's threatening to them. Not all of them are this way. Archbishop Charles Chaput in Philadelphia in the U.S. has been a big proponent of the Benedict option. He said very nice things about my book, and he wrote a book called Strangers in the Strange Land in the U.S. that says many of the same things, that we Christians, Catholics and otherwise, cannot live as if these were normal times. So there's some of us who are beginning to wake up and understand the radical nature of the times. And some pastors feel this way too. I get emails from them, Protestant pastors. But I think most churches and religious leaders resist it because they've become used to managing decline. Yes, they can see that the congregations are getting smaller and smaller every year. Maybe the heads of the people in the pews are getting grayer and grayer, but they're afraid to make radical changes. I think that they're going to have to realize one day that the water, so to speak, of the deluge is rising higher and higher, and if they don't do something different, they're going to drown. I don't say the Benedict option has to look the same way in every place. People have to adapt it to their own circumstances, to their own religious tradition. It's not going to look the same for Catholics as it does for evangelicals, say. It's not going to look the same for someone in the big city as it looks for people in the small town. But the key thing is to realize that we cannot live as we always have lived. And those pastors and religious authorities who don't understand this and are willing to think critically and deeply and act radically, they're going to go down with the ship. In the Benedict option, I did not write much about anything about the crisis of vocations in the church because this is primarily a Catholic problem in the U.S. And it's a serious problem. But Protestants and Eastern Orthodox don't have the problem like that. And I did write this book for all Christians, not just Catholics. But I think the question of vocations is a very serious and important one for the Benedict option because we're not seeing priests because families are not forming young men to desire the priesthood, and local communities aren't doing that. That's not true universally. And for example, in the Diocese of Lincoln, Nebraska in the American Midwest, they've had tremendously strong Orthodox Catholic leadership there for the last 2 bishops at least. And so they're producing enormous number of vocations, much more than you would expect for a diocese that small. So it can be done, but the church, the institutional church, can't do it alone. There needs to be a union of families too, and of parishes to create a culture that is fertile for the priesthood. I think that there's no doubt a connection between the failure of the church to give birth to vocations and the failure of Christians to have children, to have big families. We have to ask ourselves, why aren't people having big families? I think it's because people don't want to sacrifice. We're not used to the idea of suffering for a higher good, for the faith. It becomes easier to maintain our bourgeois liberty if we have no children or maybe only one child. We can save more money, use more money, have more so-called freedom, but that's death. It's the suicide of the West right there. Even in the U.S., we like to look at Europe and say, oh, they're not having children, but we are. It's not true. If it weren't for the fact that we have lots of immigration from Latin America, our population numbers would be going down too. So I think that what is lost in the churches and in Christianity in the West is a sense of sacrifice, of a sense even of martyrdom. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, we speak of marriage as a kind of martyrdom. It sounds shocking to put it that way, but if you think about it, it really is true. Jesus says that we have to die to ourselves so we can live in Him. This is what the church teaches. In the same way, in marriage, both husband and wife have to die to themselves so they can live as something greater than themselves. It's also true with children. I think that if we can recover among Western Christians a sense of asceticism, a sense that if we suffer for the kingdom of Christ, and when I say suffer, I mean maybe we don't have as many nice things as we do, but we have more children. Maybe our children become priests. Maybe our children are raised to think there's something higher than satisfying only the self, that they can serve God and everybody else through the priesthood. Then we can see a true renewal. But it will only come when we put something greater, someone greater than our individual liberty, our individual comfort. This is a secret I discovered in my own life to growing spiritually, is learning how to say no to myself, for a higher sake. When you have children of your own, suddenly it makes perfect sense that you would do anything possible for the sake of that child. I think we have to rediscover serving God in that way. And this is one of the big differences between Benedict option Christianity and mainstream Christianity. Mainstream Christianity is something, in the US at least, that has been called moralistic, therapeutic deism. And it's just a big phrase that means feel-good Christianity. A Christianity where God is like a cosmic butler who is there to serve us. We only need to speak to him when we need something. And the only thing he wants from us is to be happy and have well-being. Well, yes, God wants us to be happy and to have well-being, but God also might be calling us to martyrdom. You know, the martyrs, we have to consider them to be successful, happy people because they died for Jesus. They could only die for Jesus in those extreme moments because they lived for him throughout their lives. And I think that this is something we have to rediscover. This sort of feel-good, easy Christianity is not going to last. It's not lasting now. These people who live this way, their children are leaving the faith entirely. But those who are willing to give everything for Christ, I think they are the ones who will, the families and the communities that will produce new vocations. The best Benedict option community that I've been able to find is in Italy, the community of the Tipi. I write about them in the book. They're very orthodox in their Catholicism, but they're not angry about it. They're joyful people. They love Christ, they love the world, they love the church, but they're open to everybody. They see the faith as a grand adventure. It's no surprise that they also love G.K. Chesterton, the English Catholic writer, who was very robust and cheerful. I want to be like them. When I see them, I go down to visit them, I think that is people who live with joie de vivre. And I think it's no coincidence that they're coming out of a Catholic culture. You know, and in Louisiana, where I'm from, everybody looks at French Louisiana as the thing that we're most proud of, because everything that is truly lovely and appealing about the joie de vivre of Louisiana comes from French culture. I think it's certainly true in France. My favorite country to visit is France. My favorite city is Paris. It brings me such joy to be here. And the joy comes in large part from the value of tradition here. Certainly the value of food traditions. I mean, there's no place better in the whole world, no happier place than the outre-Atlantique, the oyster bar in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. And he didn't pay me to say that, but I take so much pleasure out of being in France because the experience Americans have coming to Paris and coming to France is suddenly finding this uncommon combination of pleasure and intellectuality. You know, French people, even if they don't have God in their hearts, they know what it's like to enjoy, to have serious fun, to take serious pleasure. And for me, I find that these things bring me to God. I'm not kidding. You're going to think this is funny, but I had my niece in Paris 5 years ago. I wanted her to see France, to see Paris. And we came here for Easter. And then on our last night, we went to this outre-Atlantique. And we were sitting there. She's 19 years old. We're having oysters. And I use that as a moment to explain the French oyster as a way of explaining sacramentality. And she laughed at me and said, "You're full of it. Uncle Rod, this is crazy." And I said, "Okay, all right, maybe this is not the right point, but it's a real point, because when I sit here and have French oysters, you know, I can feel the pleasure and the joy of the men and the women who cultivated them on the coast, and the man behind the oyster bar who shucks it so lovingly and brings it to my table. I can feel this connection, this social connection, and it's all a gift from God. When I taste that oyster and take pleasure in it, I thank God, not in any sort of very pious way, but just out of sheer joy. I love beauty. I love beauty. I love the taste of oysters, the taste of French wine, the cultures here, the traditions. These are all great gifts from God. But if we don't cherish them, if we don't celebrate them and connect them to God, we might lose them. And that's something that we have to keep in mind. I don't say this to be we call it a party pooper, but just to say that all these great things we've been given, and that France especially has been given, and that France has been given the very special privilege of bearing this culture to the world. Please embrace it, live it out, be proud of it. And one of the things you can be the most proud of is the role France has played for the church, for Christianity. I can think of no more beautiful place in the world than the cathedral at Chartres. And if you can rediscover the treasure you've all been given, oh, what a blessing it would be. Marco Sermarini, the leader of the Italian community I talked about, I asked him, what did you discover? What is the secret to the fact that you're all so Catholic and so joyful? He said, we didn't discover a secret. We only rediscovered what was right here in front of us all along, what we had been given, but we had forgotten. France has been given a tremendous treasure of graces and beauty and faith in its history and in its present. Your history lives among you like it does not live among us Americans. Rejoice in it, be glad for it, embrace it, and pass it on to your children. Because if you don't, who will?